My name is Charlotte, I am 28 years old, and I never imagined that one dinner could erase an entire lifetime. It happened inside a dining room, glowing with crystal chandeliers and polished silver. My brother was celebrating his engagement, my parents were glowing with pride, and I was sitting at the same mahogany table where I had spent my entire childhood. I thought I was part of this family, even if I never quite fit the mold. But before dessert was finished, my father looked me in the eye and said words that shattered me. If you insist on this path, you are no longer part of this family. The silence that followed was heavier than the chandelier above us. My fork froze mid-air. Even the staff seemed to stop moving. I stared at him, waiting for someone to laugh, to say it was a cruel joke. My mother only sipped her wine, her face an expressionless mask. My brother stared at his plate. My sister's eyes widened, but she stayed quiet. In that moment, I realized I was alone. I need you to understand how shocking this was for me. I had always been the so-called black sheep, yes, but I still believed that blood carried weight. I thought disappointment had limits. I was wrong. I grew up surrounded by wealth and rules. Our brownstone overlooked Boston Common. Every corner carried reminders of our legacy. I learned early what was expected: elite schools, perfect grades, obedience to the Anderson plan. My brother followed it flawlessly. My sister rebelled, but in ways that amused rather than threatened. And me? I asked questions no one wanted to hear. Why did image matter more than substance? Why did we donate to charities only to mock those who received help? Why was profit always the first measure of success? At 16, I volunteered at a legal aid clinic. I saw attorneys fighting for people with no power, people who could not pay but still deserved justice. Something lit inside me that day. It never went out. That flame guided every decision after. I still went to Harvard but studied pre-law. I argued with my father until his face turned crimson. My mother sighed and told me I was wasting potential. But I excelled. I graduated summa cum laude. I entered Harvard Law. Every step I believed my family would eventually be proud. They never were. When I passed the bar exam, the achievement that had consumed years of my life, I made the mistake of hoping again. I called my mother and asked if she would mention it in the family newsletter. Her answer cut sharper than any blade. Passing an exam thousands pass each year is hardly newsworthy. Thomas's engagement. That is worth celebrating. Still, I showed up at the dinner. I wore the navy dress my mother once complimented. I smoothed my hair into the style she preferred. I wore my grandmother's pearls, the only symbol of unconditional love I had ever known. I told myself maybe tonight would be different. Maybe they would finally see me. Instead, I was disowned between the duck breast and the cherry reduction. I cannot describe the feeling. It was as if the ground shifted beneath me. For 28 years I believed family was permanent. Suddenly, it was gone. The home I grew up in, the security I thought untouchable, the approval I always chased all vanished in one sentence. And yet, sitting there with the chandelier lights scattering across crystal and silver, I also felt something else stir inside me. Anger, resolve, maybe even freedom. Because if they could cast me aside so easily, then perhaps I had nothing left to lose by living my truth. This was only the beginning. What followed that dinner was a descent into loss, betrayal, and fear, but also a climb toward power, independence, and discovery. My name is Charlotte, and this is the story of how being rejected by my own family forced me to finally stand on my own. When the words finally landed, it felt like the room itself had tilted. I was 28 years old, a lawyer who had just passed the bar, and suddenly I had no home. I sat frozen at that heavy mahogany table, my pulse hammering in my ears while my father's face hardened into stone. My mother placed her wineglass down with a delicate clink, as if nothing extraordinary had been said. My brother avoided my gaze. My sister pressed her lips together, torn between fear and sympathy. Wilson, our butler who had served for 3 decades, shifted awkwardly near the door. I remembered how he once smuggled cookies to me after I had been sent to bed without dinner, and I wondered if he wanted to speak up now. But he said nothing. In this house, silence was loyalty. I opened my mouth to protest, to ask if they truly meant it, but my father's expression told me everything. His decision was final. And when he told Wilson to escort his former daughter out, I felt my chest crack wide open. Former daughter. A title colder than exile. I stumbled to the foyer, pearls at my ears burning against my skin. Wilson handed me my coat and keys, his eyes full of sorrow. "I'm sorry, miss. This isn't right." His whisper was the only kindness I received that night. The door closed behind me with a heavy thud. The lock clicked. And just like that, the house I had grown up in became unreachable. I stepped into the chilly Boston evening, stunned by the cruelty of it all. A few hours earlier, I had believed I was part of a family, even if I didn't fit their script. Now I was an outsider, stripped of belonging. I called a taxi back to my Cambridge apartment, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman my parents had insisted upon. As I rode through the city streets, my reflection stared back at me from the dark glass. Who was I now? A lawyer, yes. But without family, without support, without the identity that had shaped me for nearly 3 decades. That night I sat in the dark, every shadow pressing closer, unable to cry. Shock has a way of freezing even grief. I replayed the dinner scene over and over, searching for a moment when it could have turned out differently. If I had stayed quiet, if I had swallowed my truth, if I had simply accepted their offer to join the company. But every version left me hollow. Because what they wanted was not a daughter, it was another soldier in the Anderson machine. It is strange how quickly life can collapse. One moment you believe you stand on solid ground, the next you are falling through air. And in that free fall, questions come sharp and relentless. How will I pay rent? What happens when my accounts are closed? Can I survive on my own? And maybe you, listening to me now, have faced your own free fall. Maybe you know what it feels like to have the floor pulled from under you by the very people you thought would always hold you up. If you do, then you know this story is not just mine, it is a mirror. Before I go further, I want to ask something from you. If you've ever felt like the black sheep in your family, like you were cast out for simply being yourself, share your story in the comments. And if this journey resonates with you, hit subscribe and stay with me because what happens next will change everything. That night, staring at the city skyline from my glass tower, I realized my life had split in two. Behind me was the world of privilege, of expectations, of conditional love. Ahead lay an uncharted path, one filled with uncertainty but also the possibility of freedom. I didn't know it then, but being thrown out was not the end. It was the first painful step toward discovering who I really was. And soon, I would learn that losing everything can sometimes be the only way to gain yourself. I grew up in a world that looked flawless from the outside. To Boston society, the Andersons were a symbol of wealth, refinement, and permanence. Our brownstone on Beacon Hill overlooked the green expanse of the common. Inside, antique chandeliers glowed above Persian rugs, oil paintings of ancestors stared down from gilded frames, and my mother's floral arrangements perfumed every room. It was a house built to project power. Yet beneath that polished surface, I always felt like an imposter in my own home. My father, James Anderson, had turned Anderson Development into a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions. My mother, Eleanor, came from her own dynasty of old money and managed our family image with ruthless precision. Together, they crafted a script for their children. Thomas, my older brother, was cast as the heir, tall, charismatic, and obedient. Amanda, my younger sister, played the rebel role, but only in ways that were safe, attending Brown instead of Harvard, studying art instead of business, but still orbiting within the family's social universe. And then there was me, the middle child, the one who refused to play the role. From the earliest age, I asked the wrong questions. Why did we donate to charities but belittle the people those charities helped? Why did appearances matter more than honesty? Why did our dinners feel more like board meetings than family gatherings? My father would slam his hand against the mahogany table, veins straining in his neck, furious that I dared to challenge him. My mother's weapons were softer, but no less brutal: a sigh, a disappointed glance, a phrase whispered like poison. We gave you every advantage. Why must you keep disappointing us? At 16, a school project changed me forever. I volunteered at a legal aid clinic. For the first time, I saw lawyers working not for profit, but for people who had nothing. They defended tenants facing eviction, mothers escaping abuse, workers cheated out of wages. Their office had peeling paint and buzzing fluorescent lights, yet it pulsed with purpose. I felt alive there in a way I never did inside my family's marble halls. That spark never left me. When college came, I still followed the script halfway. I went to Harvard, of course, but instead of business, I chose pre-law. The arguments at home grew endless. Father demanded I reconsider, insisted I was wasting the Anderson legacy. Mother accused me of selfishness, of throwing away the future generations had built. But I refused to yield. My sense of justice had taken root too deeply. Law school only widened the gap. Every holiday dinner turned into a battlefield. I would come home with stories of clients I wanted to help, domestic violence survivors, immigrants denied basic rights, and my parents would dismiss them as those people. My brother smirked across the table, basking in father's approval as he discussed investment banks and international ventures. My sister scrolled through her phone, amused by the drama but never joining the fight. Still, they paid for my tuition and rent, perhaps clinging to the hope that I would one day come to my senses and join the company. But the deeper I went into law, the more I knew I could never betray that 16-year-old girl who had glimpsed what real justice looked like. Graduation day arrived, and with it, a bittersweet realization. I was summa cum laude, yet my mother's only comment was, "What a waste of a brilliant business mind." Even then, I thought perhaps passing the bar would change things. Perhaps finally they would see me not as a failure but as a daughter who had achieved something worthy. I was wrong. Looking back, I realize my exile from that dinner table didn't start the night they disowned me. It started years earlier, with every slammed fist, every sigh of disappointment, every moment my values clashed with theirs. The family had decided long ago that I did not belong. The dinner was only the final act. I tell you this because rejection never comes out of nowhere. It builds, quietly, through years of subtle cuts. And when the final blow lands, it feels sudden but inevitable. The night before that disastrous dinner, I held my phone in trembling hands outside my apartment building. I had just received the official results confirming I had passed the bar exam. Years of relentless study, countless sleepless nights, and sacrifices that cost me friendships and health, all condensed into one moment of triumph. For the first time in a long time, pride swelled inside me. I dialed my mother, hoping she might share in it, even a little. "Would you be willing to add this accomplishment to the family newsletter?" I asked, hesitating as soon as the words left my mouth. That newsletter, mailed to an extensive circle of Boston elites, chronicled every Anderson milestone. Engagements, property acquisitions, charity galas, all meticulously documented. I wanted, just once, to see my name there for something I had done on my own. Her pause was brief, her answer colder than the winter wind against my cheeks. "Charlotte, passing an exam that thousands pass each year is hardly newsworthy. Thomas's engagement, now, that is worth celebrating." Her words were a knife. I stood there stunned, the glow of the city lights blurring in my eyes. I should have expected it. But some part of me, perhaps the child who still longed for approval, had hoped this would be different. That maybe my hard work would matter to them. That maybe they would finally see me. Instead, my achievement was dismissed as insignificant. My brother's engagement to Stephanie Lawrence, the daughter of a shipping magnate, was deemed the true triumph. Their union promised new markets for Anderson development, fresh capital, more prestige. My success, in contrast, brought nothing of value to the family ledger. The next day, as I dressed for dinner, I felt a sickening blend of hope and dread. I chose the navy dress my mother once complimented, styled my hair in smooth waves instead of my natural curls, and fastened the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me. They were my secret talisman, the only proof I once belonged to someone who loved me without conditions. I thought, foolishly, That maybe if I played the role she had scripted, at least in appearance, my parents might acknowledge my accomplishment. The house looked as perfect as ever when I arrived. The crystal chandelier sparkled, the Waterford glasses gleamed, the scent of roasted duck filled the air. My brother stood tall beside Stephanie, who looked every inch the perfect fiancée. Blonde, elegant, clothed in an outfit that likely cost more than most people's monthly salary. My parents' faces radiated pride. My sister lounged at the table, scrolling through her phone, feigning boredom but absorbing everything. When I mentioned my bar exam success over dinner, I did it gently, during a lull between courses. I passed, I said, offering gratitude for their support, despite the tension that always lingered. I wanted to show respect, to remind them I was still their daughter, even if my path diverged. Silence. My mother sipped her wine, eyes cool and unreadable. My father cut his duck with precise surgical movements, each slice a verdict. At last he spoke. Passing an exam is hardly worth mentioning when we are celebrating your brother's engagement. He set down his knife and fork, turning to me with the tone of a man negotiating a business contract. Have you reconsidered my offer to join Anderson Development? We could use an in-house counsel. I swallowed hard. My heart pounded, but I had to speak the truth. Actually, I've been offered a position at the Boston Legal Aid Foundation. It's the organization that inspired me when I was 16. They help people who have nowhere else to turn. His face darkened. That little charity? Do you understand how embarrassing it is for me to tell people my daughter works with criminals and welfare cases? The words struck like hammers. My mother's voice followed, soft but deadly. We tolerated your phase of rebellion. We paid for Harvard Law. And this is how you repay us? By throwing it all away? I looked around the table. My brother shifted uncomfortably. Stephanie lowered her gaze. Amanda's eyes flickered with curiosity, maybe even sympathy, but she said nothing. I tried to steady my voice. These are citizens. They deserve representation. This work allows me to make a real difference. My father scoffed. The only difference you're making is humiliating this family. Thomas is building value. You, after everything we gave you, choose to spit in our faces. Something inside me broke then. The words slipped out before I could stop them. I never asked to be part of a family that values money over people. The silence that followed was unbearable. My father's face turned from red to a dangerous shade of purple. When he finally spoke, each word was ice. Then perhaps you shouldn't be part of this family at all. I had crossed an invisible line. There was no going back. The moment those words left my father's mouth, the air in the dining room thickened into something I could almost choke on. My pulse pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mother dabbed her lips with her linen napkin, as though nothing catastrophic had just been declared. Thomas stared at his plate, unable to meet my eyes, while Stephanie's smile froze into polite discomfort. Amanda's phone slipped from her hands, her expression caught between disbelief and fascination. I tried to form words, but my father's voice overrode mine. "Wilson!" he barked, summoning the butler who had raised us in quieter ways than our parents ever did. "Escort her out. Retrieve her apartment keys. Make sure she takes them. And inform the financial advisor that her access ends tonight." It was swift, brutal, the kind of decision only a man who valued money above blood could deliver with such composure. Wilson looked at me, pain written across his lined face. He had patched my scraped knees when I was little, slipped me cookies when I was punished, offered small kindnesses no one else in that house bothered with. Now he was ordered to erase me like a name from a ledger. "Father," I whispered, desperate for one last thread of hope. "You can't mean this." But his glare was merciless. "I mean every word. You are no longer welcome here." The room tilted. My body moved on instinct, following Wilson as he guided me from the table. Behind me, silver cutlery clinked against china, conversation resuming as if nothing had happened. As if I had never existed. In the foyer, Wilson handed me my coat and a small envelope with my apartment keys. His voice broke when he whispered, "I'm sorry, miss. This isn't right." Outside, the evening air slapped me awake. The front door shut behind me with a thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of the lock turning. The key to my childhood home was now nothing more than a useless piece of metal in my hand. I stumbled down the granite steps and hailed a taxi. My body shook as though I had been dropped into freezing water. By the time I reached my Cambridge apartment, tears had blurred the city lights into smears of gold and blue. Inside, the silence was unbearable. I sank onto my designer couch, staring at the view my parents had insisted I needed for security and appearances. I realized that security was gone. My accounts would be frozen, my credit cards canceled, my rent no longer guaranteed. Everything had been stripped in the span of one dinner. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every word, every look. I thought of my grandmother's pearls at my ears, glowing with a love that felt long extinct. I thought of the years I had fought to be seen, and I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake, if speaking the truth had cost me more than I could bear. But then another thought came, quiet but insistent. If their love could vanish so quickly, had it ever been real? I sat by the window until dawn, the city waking beneath me. Somewhere deep down, a new question began to form. Maybe this wasn't an ending. Maybe it was the beginning of something I had never dared to imagine. A life on my own terms. And I want to ask you because maybe you've been here too. Have you ever spoken the truth and paid a price you never expected? Have you stood your ground only to find the ground crumbling beneath you? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story. Because when we share the moments that break us, we realize we're not alone. That night marked my exile. But it also planted a seed of freedom. I didn't know it yet. But losing everything my family provided would force me to discover what I was truly capable of. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the nightmare had hardened into reality. My phone buzzed with notifications that felt like hammer blows. The first was from my bank. My checking account, which had held $5,000 the day before, now displayed a balance of zero. My savings account, $15,000 I had carefully preserved from my last semester, was gone too. Every card in my wallet was useless. I had been erased not only from my family but from the financial world they had built around me. I called my sister Amanda in a panic. Her voice was hushed, like she was hiding in the hallway to keep our parents from hearing. "Charlotte, are you okay?" she whispered. I laughed bitterly. "Do I sound okay? My accounts are empty." Her pause told me everything. Father called the advisor right after dinner. He froze everything. He said if I tried to interfere, he would cut me off too. Her words were trembling, but I couldn't even blame her for staying quiet. She was still financially dependent, still tied to the gilded cage I had been shoved out of. A message from my landlord arrived next. My parents had already contacted him. Their guarantee on my luxury apartment lease was revoked. I had 30 days to either find a new guarantor or vacate. 30 days. My heart pounded as I stared out at the skyline, every tower gleaming like a cruel reminder of how fragile my life of privilege had always been. I spent the afternoon making desperate calls. Friends answered kindly, their voices dripping with sympathy, but most of them couldn't offer real help. They lived in the same glossy bubble, unable to imagine giving up their own comfort for me. One classmate, Jasmine, who came from a middle-class background, didn't hesitate. "Crash on my couch," she said. "We'll figure it out." Humiliation washed over me. I had walked out of marble foyers into courtrooms. I had argued with professors at Harvard Law. And now I was begging for a couch to sleep on. But I had no choice. Packing was the hardest part. I looked around my pristine apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and realized I couldn't keep any of it. Storage companies wanted fees I couldn't afford. So, I began selling everything: designer furniture, rugs, art pieces chosen for me by my mother. Each sale felt like stripping away the skin of the life I had once known. The cruelest moment came when I carried my grandmother's pearl necklace into a pawn shop. It matched the earrings I had worn to that dinner, the last physical link to the only family member who had loved me without conditions. The shopkeeper studied it, then said gently, $800. I knew it was worth at least 10 times more, but desperation doesn't negotiate. I let it go. My throat tight as he wrote out a receipt promising I could buy it back within 90 days. That night, on Jasmine's lumpy couch, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the muffled voices of her roommate. Her apartment was small, cluttered, imperfect, but it was warm, and that warmth cut deeper than the silence of my luxury apartment had ever managed. The following days were a crash course in survival. I learned to buy store brands at the supermarket. I discovered the library offered free internet, sparing me from buying endless cups of coffee just to use cafe Wi-Fi. I watched which restaurants threw away good food at closing time. It was humiliating, yes, but also strangely humanizing. I had lived in a world where money insulated me from reality. Now reality had stripped me bare. Every night I felt grief rise like a wave. Grief for my family, for the pearls, for the girl who thought passing the bar exam would bring love. But alongside the grief, something else stirred: resilience. Because if I could survive being cut off, if I could rebuild from nothing, then maybe I would finally learn what I was made of. The days that followed were the most humbling of my life. I had fallen from a penthouse to a couch in a tiny apartment in Somerville. The living room smelled faintly of old carpet, and the couch sagged in the middle, but it became my refuge. Jasmine and her roommate welcomed me without judgment. They shared their pasta dinners, their laughter, their mismatched furniture, and suddenly I was living in a world I had never truly seen before, a world where survival depended not on prestige, but on kindness. Every morning, I woke with a jolt of panic. I was 28, a Harvard Law graduate, yet I had no steady income, no savings, and only 3 weeks before my official position at Boston Legal Aid began. But even then, the salary was modest, $45,000 a year. That number, once unthinkably low to me, now looked like a fragile lifeline. I needed something to bridge the gap. I took a temporary job at a document review company, combing through endless files for pennies compared to what corporate lawyers earned. The work was numbing, but the paycheck meant I could contribute to groceries at Jasmine's apartment. It was the first time I paid for food with money I had earned entirely on my own. It tasted different, simpler, but more satisfying. Still, I felt stripped bare. I had gone from elegant galas to counting every dollar at the supermarket. I sold my last designer handbag on a resale site, bargaining with strangers who haggled over its worth. Each sale was another piece of my old identity gone. And yet, a strange liberation accompanied the loss. Without the weight of appearances, I was free to simply exist. But freedom comes with fear. At night, lying awake on that sagging couch, I wondered, what if I fail? What if I cannot make it? My family had always predicted I would collapse without their support. Was I proving them right? One evening, Jasmine found me staring blankly at my laptop, scrolling through job boards. "You're stronger than you think," she said quietly. "I know this feels like the end, but sometimes the end is just the first step toward something bigger." Her words struck me, because as much as I feared the collapse, I also sensed that something was shifting inside me. For the first time in my life, I was standing without the safety net of the Anderson fortune. It was terrifying, but it was also the beginning of real independence. And here is where I need to pause. Because what happened next changed everything again. If you stay with me, you will see how one email, just a week after that fateful dinner, cracked open a secret my family had hidden for years. It was the key that turned my exile into empowerment, the revelation that shifted all the power into my hands. So I want you to keep watching. Don't leave this story here, because the twist you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and power. That night, before the email arrived, I stood by Jasmine's small kitchen window, looking out at the modest street below. No chandeliers, no chauffeurs, no antique vases. Just neighbors laughing as they carried groceries, kids chasing each other in the fading light, the smell of pasta sauce drifting from an open window. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar in my chest. Not envy, not shame, peace. And yet, I knew peace was temporary. My father had cut me off, but I had lived in his shadow too long to believe he was finished. The Anderson family never left loose ends. Something was coming. I could feel it. I didn't know then that an email from my father's own lawyer would soon land in my inbox. An email that would expose not only a hidden fortune, but also the truth about where I really stood in this family. It happened on a gray afternoon, exactly 1 week after that dinner. I was hunched over Jasmine's kitchen table, sorting through job applications, when my email pinged. At first I thought it was another rejection from a firm I had applied to out of desperation, but when I saw the sender, my heart skipped a beat. George Hamilton, my father's attorney for as long as I could remember. The subject line read only one word: urgent. My stomach clenched. Why would he contact me now, after my parents had cut me off? I hovered over the message, half afraid to open it. When I finally clicked, my eyes raced across the screen. Dear Miss Anderson, a matter of extreme urgency has come to my attention regarding your financial situation. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss. This is time-sensitive and impacts you directly. Regards, George Hamilton. I stared at the words, suspicion prickling at the back of my neck. Was this another ploy? A way for my father to humiliate me further? Or was there something more? Jasmine leaned over my shoulder, frowning. Sounds fishy. Why would your parents' lawyer reach out if they've disowned you? I swallowed hard. I don't know, but George, he's known me since I was a child. He never struck me as cruel. He always seemed fair, even kind in his own quiet way. Still, doubt gnawed at me. My parents had lied before. They had manipulated every detail of my life. Could this be another trap? I debated for hours, pacing Jasmine's small living room, running through every scenario. Finally, I dialed the number in the signature block. My voice shook, but I forced it steady. This is Charlotte Anderson for George Hamilton. There was a pause, then his familiar voice, older now, but still measured. Charlotte, thank you for calling. I was worried you might ignore my message. I almost did, I admitted. I'm not eager to hear more bad news from anyone connected to my family. This isn't what you think, he said, his tone laced with something that sounded almost like guilt. There's a matter I need to discuss with you in person. It concerns your grandmother's estate. Can you meet me tomorrow? Somewhere public, somewhere you feel safe. My breath caught. My grandmother, Rose Anderson, the only family member who ever truly loved me. She had died when I was 16, leaving behind only memories, and the pearl earrings I still clung to. My parents had never spoken much about her estate. They had said she left a small education fund that had long since been used up. Now, doubt flared. What if that wasn't true? I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near Boston Common. After hanging up, I sat motionless, the receiver heavy in my hand. Jasmine watched me closely. What did he say? He wants to talk about my grandmother's estate, I whispered. Even saying the words felt dangerous. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts swirled with questions. Why now? Why me? Could there really be something my parents had hidden all these years? I thought about the pearls, about the way my grandmother used to take my hand and tell me, "You see the truth others ignore. Don't ever let them silence you." The next day, I arrived early at the coffee shop. I chose a table with a clear view of the door, my nerves stretched taut. I watched every customer who walked in, my chest tightening each time. When George finally appeared, he looked older than I remembered, his shoulders stooped, his face lined with exhaustion. He greeted me warmly but with caution, as though aware of the fragile ground between us. After ordering a black coffee, he leaned closer across the table. His voice dropped low. "Charlotte, are you familiar with the trust your grandmother established for you?" The world seemed to stop. "Trust?" I repeated. "My parents said it was just a small education fund, that it was gone after college." His expression tightened. "That isn't accurate. Rose Anderson created a substantial trust for each of her grandchildren. Thomas received his when he turned 25. Amanda will receive hers next year. Yours was different. Your grandmother wrote that it would be released when you completed graduate school or turned 30. You've now met the condition." I felt dizzy. "How much are we talking about?" He hesitated, then said quietly, $2 million. And it has grown over the years. The coffee shop spun around me. $2 million. My parents had known. They had hidden it. They had used it. In that moment, rage surged through me. Everything they had done, cutting me off, freezing my accounts, humiliating me, wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. They had stolen my inheritance, the gift my grandmother had left to protect me. I clenched my hands around the coffee cup, trembling. My life had changed in an instant once again, but this time, the power was shifting, and I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't powerless anymore. The word trust echoed in my ears long after George spoke it. I could hardly breathe as I stared at him across that coffee shop table. $2 million. My grandmother had left me $2 million, and my parents had never said a word. For years they had let me believe I had nothing of my own. They had frozen my accounts, cut me off, humiliated me, while secretly holding the key to my independence. George cleared his throat, his eyes heavy with guilt. The funds are still there, Charlotte, but your parents have been borrowing against them, using the assets as collateral for Anderson development. That is a direct violation of their fiduciary duty. I leaned back, the chair creaking under my weight. It was as though the puzzle of my entire life had suddenly rearranged into a cruel picture. My parents hadn't just disowned me for choosing legal aid. They had been protecting their theft. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice low. You're their lawyer, not mine. His gaze held mine, steady but pained. Because what they are doing is illegal, and because your grandmother trusted me to act with integrity. I couldn't live with myself if I let this continue unchecked. I felt anger pulse hot in my veins. For years I had thought I was powerless, the black sheep with no leverage. Now I realized the opposite was true. My parents needed me more than I needed them. My inheritance was the lifeline they had been secretly draining. The ground beneath my life shifted again, but this time in my favor. For the first time since that terrible dinner, I felt something sharp and electric. Power. George slid a folder across the table. Here are copies of the trust documents and records of the transactions your parents authorized. If you go to court, you will win. They know this. That is why they want to meet with you. Tomorrow, at my office. I touched the folder, my fingers trembling. Inside lay the truth, every lie my parents had told unraveling in black and white. That night, back at Jasmine's apartment, I couldn't sleep. I spread the documents across her small dining table, reading every line. My grandmother had known me better than I realized. She had set this trust apart from my siblings, releasing it only if I completed graduate school. She must have sensed the storm that would come, that my parents would try to crush me if I refused their path. She had left me a shield, a weapon, and a future. Jasmine hovered over my shoulder, eyes wide. This changes everything. They tried to break you because they knew this was coming. Her words hit like lightning. My parents hadn't disowned me out of disappointment alone. They had disowned me to control me, to keep me from realizing what was mine. I sat back, my pulse racing. Tomorrow, I would face them again. Not as the desperate daughter begging for scraps of approval, but as a lawyer armed with evidence, with leverage, with truth. And I have to ask you, what would you do in my position? If you discovered the very people who raised you had hidden a fortune meant for you, would you fight them in court, or would you try to forgive and reconcile? Tell me in the comments. I want to know if you would choose family or justice. As dawn broke, I gathered the papers into a neat stack. For years my father had told me I was weak, ungrateful, incapable. Tomorrow, he would see just how wrong he was. Because this was no longer about rebellion, it was about betrayal, law, and survival. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into a battle empty-handed. I was ready to fight. The next afternoon, I walked into the glass tower downtown that housed Hamilton and Associates. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and old money. I had been here countless times as a child, trailing behind my father, told to sit quietly while real business was conducted. This time, I entered not as James Anderson's daughter but as Charlotte Anderson, attorney at law. And I wasn't alone. Beside me walked Susan Park, a litigator recommended by one of my professors. She specialized in trust law and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had fought bigger battles than this. When I explained my situation, she agreed immediately to represent me. Her words still rang in my ears. "We are not going in looking for a fight, but we will be prepared for one." The receptionist blinked when she saw me, her smile faltering as she glanced at Susan. Then she picked up the phone, her voice tight. "Mr. Hamilton is expecting them." We were led to a long conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. At the far end sat my parents. My father wore a bespoke navy suit, his jaw clenched, his eyes sharp. My mother was dressed in a cream knit ensemble, pearls gleaming against her throat, her face arranged into a mask of maternal concern. George Hamilton sat at the head of the table, files stacked neatly before him. "Charlotte," my mother said, rising as though to embrace me. "Darling, how wonderful to see you." I stepped back, my voice firm. "This is Susan Park, my attorney. She stays." A flicker of irritation crossed my father's face. "There's no need for outside counsel. This is a family matter." I met his gaze without flinching. "You made it clear last week I was not family. Miss Park stays." George cleared his throat, his tone calm but strained. "Now that everyone is here, let's review the situation." The trust established by Rose Anderson stipulated release upon Charlotte's completion of graduate education. That condition has been met. The trust is currently valued at approximately $2.3 million and should be transferred to her control immediately. My father leaned forward, clasping his hands as though he were negotiating a deal. "Before we rush into any transfers, let's remember that family unity is paramount. Charlotte, your mother and I regret the unpleasantness of last week. We're willing to put that behind us. What matters is preserving the Anderson legacy." My mother reached across the table, her voice honeyed. "Darling, you know how your father can be when he's passionate. He didn't mean those words literally. Of course you are still part of the family." Susan's tone cut through the air like a blade. "My client appreciates the sentiment. But we are here to discuss the trust. We require full documentation of all transactions involving the assets, including loans and collateralizations over the past 12 years. My father's smile vanished. "That won't be necessary. We have a proposal that resolves everything amicably." He nodded at George, who slid a document across the table. I recognized the format immediately. A trust transfer agreement. But as Susan scanned it, her eyebrows shot up. "This document restructures the trust assets under Anderson Development Corporation," she said, her voice crisp. "My client would receive a small annual distribution but forfeit all control. In effect, you are asking her to sign over her inheritance to your company." My father spread his hands, feigning reasonableness. "It provides financial security for Charlotte while ensuring the assets remain aligned with the family's interests. It is a win-win." I stared at the papers, a familiar ache rising in my chest. For years I had felt this same anger and disappointment whenever my true self clashed with their expectations. But this time, something was different. I wasn't the powerless child desperate for approval. I was a lawyer, holding evidence of their misconduct. I pushed the document back across the table. "Number." My father blinked, genuinely surprised, as though the idea of refusal had never occurred to him. "I don't think you understand what's being offered." "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice steady. "You disowned me. You cut me off. And now you want me to give up my inheritance because you were caught misusing it. I won't." My mother's lips trembled. "Charlotte, please." But I didn't let her finish. "This is not a family conversation. This is a legal matter. And I intend to treat it as one." Across the table, my father's face darkened to that familiar crimson. I had seen it countless times when I was younger, but this time, I didn't flinch. This time, I had power. The silence that followed my refusal was thick enough to cut. My father's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on the table. I had seen that expression before during childhood arguments, during every holiday that turned into a battlefield, but this time, I wasn't a frightened daughter. I was a lawyer with evidence on my side. His voice came low, almost a growl. Be reasonable, Charlotte. If you push this adversarially, you will regret it. Our family has influence in every corner of this city. One phone call, and your so-called legal aid position disappears. One whisper, and you will never find work in law again. The words slammed into me like a blow. A younger version of myself would have shrunk under that threat. I knew he wasn't exaggerating, he did have that power. But fear did not rise in me, not this time. Instead, clarity spread through me like fire. For the first time, I saw the pattern clearly. Control through intimidation, loyalty demanded at the price of silence. I leaned forward, my voice steady. Is that really the approach you want to take? Threatening your own daughter? Because Miss Park has already prepared documentation for the probate court. Every irregular transaction, every loan against my trust. And I suspect the Massachusetts Bar Association would be very interested to hear how a prominent businessman tried to coerce a newly licensed attorney. My father's face flushed deep red, the color of fury barely restrained. Ungrateful, he spat. Everything you are, everything you have, comes from me. I met his gaze, unflinching. Everything I am comes from the choices I made despite you. The door to the conference room opened then, and my brother Thomas stepped in, followed closely by Amanda. My father had clearly summoned reinforcements, hoping to corner me with family pressure. Charlotte, Thomas began, his tone smooth and practiced, the voice he always used to de-escalate. You're taking this too far. We're family. We work things out together, not with outside lawyers and threats. I looked at him, the golden son who had never once stood by me when it mattered. You stayed silent when they disowned me. You watched while they cut me off and froze my accounts. Don't talk to me about family. Amanda said nothing at first. Her eyes darted between me and our parents, conflict plain on her face. For a fleeting moment, I saw sympathy there, maybe even admiration. But she didn't speak. She never did when the cost was too high. My father slammed his hand on the table, making the documents flutter. Enough! Either you sign the agreement and return to this family on our terms, or you walk out of here and lose us forever. Your choice. The ultimatum. His weapon of choice. Always. Growing up, it had been smaller things. Obey or lose privileges. Comply or lose affection. Now it was writ large. Surrender or lose the family entirely. I stood slowly, gathering my papers. My pulse was steady, my voice calm. Then I choose me. I choose the path Grandma Rose believed in enough to protect. I choose a life where I am valued for who I am, not for what I can add to the Anderson balance sheet. My mother's hand trembled on the table. Darling, please. I shook my head. You told me I wasn't part of this family anymore. And you were right. Family doesn't treat you like a liability. Family doesn't steal from you, threaten you, or discard you when you refuse to obey. I turned toward the door, Susan gathering her briefcase beside me. My father's voice rang out behind me, thunderous with rage. You'll regret this, Charlotte. Without us, you are nothing. I paused, my hand on the doorframe, and looked back at them, at my controlling father, my image-obsessed mother, my compliant brother, and my conflicted sister. Only Amanda's eyes met mine, wide and uncertain, the faint glimmer of something human flickering there. Actually, I said quietly, I think I'm just beginning to discover who I really am. Then I walked out. For the first time in my life, the chains of their power snapped, and though the pain of rejection still clung to me, I felt something else settle in its place: freedom. Walking out of that office was like stepping into a new world. The sky above Boston Harbor looked sharper, the air crisper, as though the city itself had shifted. I wasn't the same woman who had entered that conference room. I had chosen myself over the Anderson empire, and while the pain of that choice lingered, so did an unexpected lightness. The first thing I did after gaining control of my trust was nothing. Susan advised me to wait, to breathe, to avoid rash decisions. When people go from nothing to sudden wealth, mistakes are inevitable, she warned. I listened. For the first time in my life, I had both power and space to decide how to use it. No more manipulation. No more family strings attached. I moved out of Jasmine's apartment. though leaving her couch was bittersweet. She had sheltered me during my darkest days. Her friendship reminded me what real loyalty looked like, loyalty born of choice, not obligation. Instead of returning to a penthouse or luxury tower, I chose a modest one-bedroom in Jamaica Plain. It was small, yes, but the deed was in my name, purchased outright with a portion of my trust. For the first time, I lived in a space that was truly mine. When my official position at Boston Legal Aid began, I threw myself into the work. The salary, $45,000 a year, looked tiny beside my trust, but it carried something priceless: meaning. Every day, I sat across from tenants facing eviction, mothers seeking protection orders, immigrants fighting for benefits. Their stories were raw, their struggles brutal, and each case reminded me why I had chosen this path in the first place. I lived on my salary and preserved the trust for long-term investments. It wasn't about luxury anymore. It was about building a foundation no one could strip from me. I started a fellowship in my grandmother's name, the Rose Anderson Fellowship, to fund law students who wanted to pursue public interest careers despite financial obstacles. Watching the first recipient, a brilliant first-generation student who had once been homeless, step into a classroom without the weight of debt brought me more joy than any gala or yacht ever could. But freedom was not without shadows. The rejection still ached at night, memories of my father's voice. "Without us, you are nothing," echoed when the apartment was too quiet. I wondered if Amanda thought of me, if she regretted staying silent. I wondered if Thomas even cared. And I began to sense that my parents weren't finished with me. They had lost their grip, but the Andersons never surrendered easily. I could almost feel their presence lingering at the edges of my new life. One day, I knew, they would try to reel me back. And here's where I'll let you in on a secret. What comes next will test me even more. I had thought breaking free was the final battle, but the real twist was still ahead. If you stay with me, you'll see how my family tried one last time to pull me back, and how I answered in a way that changed everything. In the meantime, I focused on building not just a career, but a life. I joined a community garden. I volunteered at a youth writing program. I even allowed myself to fall into a new relationship with a high school history teacher I met at a neighborhood potluck. He knew nothing of Boston's elite world, and that was exactly why I trusted him. For once, I was seen as a woman, not a surname. Holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving without my family felt like staring into an empty mirror. But Jasmine's family welcomed me with open arms. They passed food across a crowded table, laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks, and raised a toast in my name. "To Charlotte," her father said warmly, "the newest member of our chosen family." The simple words broke something open inside me. I realized family isn't defined by blood, but by who stays when the storm comes. I was healing, slowly, painfully. And though the Anderson name still carried weight in Boston's business circles, I carried something far more valuable now: integrity, freedom, and a new beginning. The first months at Boston Legal Aid were a blur of case files stacked higher than my head, and clients who carried more heartbreak than I thought possible. Every morning, I walked into that modest office, with peeling paint on the walls and buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. It couldn't have been further from the glossy boardrooms of Anderson Development. But it felt alive, real. One case in particular consumed me. A group of immigrant families living in an old apartment complex, Riverview Apartments, were facing mass eviction. Their landlord, a man who saw tenants as nothing more than dollar signs, had been systematically forcing people out so he could renovate the units and triple the rent. The families had nowhere to go. Some had children in the local schools, some were caring for elderly parents. Eviction meant losing not just their homes, but their entire lives. I threw myself into the case. Night after night, I sat at my desk, poring over lease agreements, city codes, and prior rulings. The work was exhausting, but it fueled me in a way corporate law never could have. Every clause I highlighted, every precedent I found, wasn't just a legal strategy, it was a shield for people who had been told they didn't matter. In court, the landlord's lawyers came prepared with sharp suits and smug confidence. they assumed we were outmatched. But as I stood to deliver my arguments, I felt my voice steady, stronger than I had ever heard it before. I spoke about contracts, yes, but also about dignity, about families who deserved more than to be treated as disposable obstacles to profit. The judge listened, the tenants listened. Even opposing counsel seemed rattled. When the decision came, it was a victory. The court blocked the evictions and set a precedent that would protect hundreds of vulnerable families across Massachusetts. The moment the judge read the ruling, the families erupted into tears, hugs, and prayers in languages that filled the courtroom with hope. One little boy ran up to me and pressed a crumpled drawing into my hand, a stick figure with a cape, labeled lawyer. I walked out of that courthouse feeling something I had never felt in my parents' world, pride that didn't depend on their approval. The next morning, the Boston Globe ran a small feature on the case. The article highlighted not just the ruling, but the fact that I, Charlotte Anderson, had chosen a different path from my powerful family. The reporter asked me about it, and I spoke honestly. Justice matters more than image, I told her. I chose this work because people deserve to be heard, no matter their bank account. The article spread farther than I expected. Colleagues from law school reached out with congratulations. Other nonprofits called to say they were using our case as a model. And then, of course, my parents noticed. A text arrived from my mother that evening. No congratulations, no recognition of what I had achieved. Just, we saw the paper. Your father is concerned about how this reflects on the family. Please be discreet in future press interactions. I stared at the screen, anger bubbling but quickly cooling into clarity. Their only concern was image. Even when I fought for families on the brink of losing everything, they saw only a threat to their reputation. That text was proof. I had made the right choice. For years, I had equated success with their approval. Now, success meant standing in a courtroom, defending the powerless, and walking out knowing I had made a difference. And that's something I want to ask you. What do you consider true success? Is it wealth, titles, recognition? Or is it the quiet satisfaction of knowing you changed someone's life for the better? Share your answer in the comments, because I believe these stories aren't just mine, they're ours. The case at Riverview Apartments was only the beginning. It solidified my reputation, gave me momentum, and proved that I could thrive outside the shadow of the Anderson empire. My father's threats, my mother's disdain, my brother's silence, they no longer held power over me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something of my own. Months slipped by, and my life settled into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply right. I spent my days in courtrooms and cramped offices, my evenings at community gardens or small neighborhood gatherings. For the first time, I woke each morning knowing I was exactly where I was meant to be. But the Anderson family wasn't done with me. They never were. The first sign came in the form of a formal envelope, embossed with the family crest. Inside was an invitation to the annual Easter brunch, a grand affair at the Beacon Hill brownstone, attended by extended family and business associates. The handwritten note attached said only, "Family should be together for holidays." I stared at it for hours, my gut twisted with conflicting emotions. Part of me longed to walk back into that house, head held high, proof that I had survived. But another part, the wiser part, recognized the trap. That brunch wasn't about reconciliation. It was about appearances. My presence would serve as proof that nothing had changed, that the Anderson family remained united and untouchable. I declined politely but firmly. Instead, I spent Easter volunteering at a community meal program, serving food to strangers who treated me with more warmth than my own parents ever had. As I ladled soup into bowls, laughter and conversation swirling around me, I knew I had chosen correctly. Still, my family's shadow loomed. My sister Amanda began reaching out in secret. One afternoon she asked to meet at a quiet cafe, far from the eyes of our social circle. She looked out of place in her designer dress, her jewelry glittering against the mismatched tables and local art on the walls. "So this is how the other half lives," she joked weakly, her eyes darting around the room. "Most of the world lives this way," I replied gently. "Our bubble was the exception, not the rule." She stirred her coffee, her facade cracking. Father uses your empty seat at dinner as a warning. He says, "This is what happens when you defy me." But I think he's scared. The business isn't as stable without access to your trust. Her confession shook me. I didn't want to hurt the employees of Anderson Development, but I refused to let my parents continue exploiting my inheritance. They don't want my help, Amanda, I said softly. They want my compliance. There's a difference. She nodded slowly, her eyes flickering with something I hadn't seen before: admiration, maybe even longing. I envy you, Charlotte. You walked away. I don't know if I ever could. That conversation marked a shift. Amanda wasn't ready to break free, but the cracks in her loyalty had begun to show. And I knew those cracks terrified our parents more than anything I could ever do. My father's own mask began to slip as well. At a fundraising gala for legal aid organizations, I ran into my parents for the first time since the confrontation at George's office. My father looked older, the strain of recent months etched in the lines around his eyes. My mother still radiated perfection, but her smile seemed brittle, as if held together by sheer will. "Charlotte," she said with a practiced air kiss, as though we were cordial acquaintances instead of estranged. "How lovely to see you." My father nodded stiffly. "You're looking well." "I am well," I answered, meeting his gaze without fear. He cleared his throat. "The business has faced challenges. Without certain leveraging options, we've had to scale back. Thomas is doing his best, but it's not easy." It was the closest thing to an admission of need I'd ever heard from him. Yet still, he framed it as my problem to solve. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said sincerely. "But my trust isn't a family slush fund. It was Grandma Rose's gift to me, not to Anderson Development." His eyes narrowed, disappointment flashing as familiar as it was exhausting. But for the first time, I didn't feel crushed beneath it. His disapproval had lost its power. Later that evening, Amanda texted me. "He's rattled. You're stronger than he expected." I think you've changed everything." Maybe I had. For years my family defined me by what I wasn't: obedient, useful, compliant. Now, I was teaching them what I was: independent, determined, unwilling to bow. And the rift was only widening. 1 year after the dinner that shattered my life, I stood in my modest apartment in Jamaica Plain, sunlight spilling across walls decorated with local art I had chosen myself. The place was small, the furniture second-hand, but every corner carried the weight of freedom. I no longer woke to my father's demands or my mother's sighs of disappointment. I woke to silence, and within that silence lived peace. My days were full, not with luxury, but with purpose. At Boston Legal Aid, I headed a small housing justice team, mentoring younger attorneys while handling my own cases. I was no longer just surviving. I was shaping something lasting. When the Rose Anderson Fellowship funded its first recipient, a brilliant law student who had once been homeless, I felt my grandmother's presence more strongly than ever. Her faith in me had not been wasted. Amanda and I maintained our secret bond, meeting monthly in quiet cafes or bookstores. Each time, she seemed more restless within the gilded cage of our family. "I've been talking to Susan about protecting my trust when it comes next year," she admitted once, her coffee trembling in her hands. "I don't want Father to control it." Her words made me smile. My fight had planted a seed. Whether she realized it or not, she was finding her courage. My brother Thomas remained my father's soldier, barely acknowledging me when we crossed paths at public events. That used to sting, but now it felt more like confirmation. He had made his choice. I had made mine. Even my parents began to falter. At a farmer's market one spring morning, I bumped into them by accident. My mother, usually immaculate, stepped into a puddle and ruined her shoes. Instead of exploding, my father reached out to steady her, his hand trembling faintly. He looked older, worn down by battles both financial and personal. We sat for coffee nearby, conversation awkward but civil. For the first time, I saw not titans of industry, but two aging people struggling to reconcile pride with regret. My father asked, "So what is family, according to Charlotte Anderson?" I looked him in the eye. Acceptance without conditions. Support without control. Love without agenda. He scoffed, but the edge in his voice was duller than before. And as I left, he said quietly, "Your grandmother would be proud." The words stopped me in my tracks. For once, I believed him. That night, I stood by my window, gazing at the Boston skyline. The ache of rejection still lived in me, but it no longer defined me. I had discovered something my parents would never understand, that freedom born from rejection can become the greatest inheritance of all. And maybe you're listening to me now because you've felt it too. Maybe you've been cast aside, told you weren't enough, forced to choose between their approval and your truth. If that's you, let me tell you, choosing yourself is terrifying, yes, but it's also the only way to find peace. I had lost my family name, my accounts, my home. But in their place, I had found something far greater. My voice, my values, my chosen family, and those things could never be stripped away. If this story resonated with you, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel, because I have more stories of resilience, betrayal, and transformation that will remind you you are not alone. And if you want to see how others rebuilt their lives after walking away from toxic families, go watch the next video linked right here. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Because sometimes, the most painful goodbye is the first step toward a life you were always meant to live. Looking back now, I can see the strange beauty hidden within the pain. For years, I thought my worth depended on the approval of people who could never truly see me. I fought for their affection, twisted myself into shapes they might admire, and let their silence weigh heavier than any praise. But when the rejection finally came public, merciless, absolute, it forced me to stop searching for validation outside myself. In losing everything, I discovered freedom. I no longer live inside a mansion filled with antiques and cold expectations. I live in a modest apartment filled with laughter, warmth, and secondhand furniture chosen because it brings me joy, not prestige. I no longer sit at dinner tables where love is conditional and silence is demanded. Instead, I share meals with friends who ask nothing of me except honesty. My grandmother's trust gave me security, yes, but her true gift was courage. She saw the truth of our family long before I did. She believed I would one day need the strength to walk away, and she made sure I could. That legacy lives in me now, not just in dollars, but in choices, in values, in the path I carve for myself. Family, I've learned, is not just the blood that runs through your veins. It is the people who stand beside you when the storm comes. It is acceptance without conditions. It is the freedom to be exactly who you are. So if you are listening and carrying the ache of rejection, let my story remind you, sometimes the door that slams in your face is the one that sets you free. And on the other side of that door, you may just find the life you were meant to live all along.